to Researcher Revealed, the podcast where we go behind the name that's on the publication or presentation or conference proceeding to get to know that person who's behind that piece of research, how they got into research, why they're researching the area that they are, all of those sorts of details. On today's episode number 11, we are very fortunate to have Professor Calvin Moorley with us, and he's going to talk to us all about his journey into research and the reasons why he does so much research around issues related not just to stroke and cardiovascular health, but also social injustice areas. So strap yourself in, and I hope you enjoy this latest episode. Hello, and welcome to the next episode on Researcher Revealed. Today we have joining us Calvin Moorley. He's professor at nursing up in London. Actually, I'm going to hand over to you, Calvin, and just introduce yourself to everybody. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Calvin Moorley. I'm a professor at London South Bank University. Rosalind is correct. I'm in the nursing faculty, and my chair is in diversity and social justice.
Thank you. So, Calvin, I'm not sure how many of our episodes you've actually listened to, but the first thing we like to do to kind of get to know you a little bit better and set the tone for the conversation is we do what I call the Rapid 11. So this is quick answer, little questions about how you work, things you like, whatnot. Nothing too personal, but just a little bit about your role and how you choose to work as a researcher. So, are you ready for the Rapid 11?
I'll try. I'm ready.
There's no right and wrong answers. There's no reason to panic. They really are very easy. The first one is, are you a Windows or a Mac user?
Oh, definitely a Mac. Always a Mac.
Oh, that's very controversial, actually. I think you may be the second or third out of everybody who's been on the podcast who's a Mac user. So you're among the rare ones. Next question. Do you drink tea or coffee?
I'm a decaf black Americano, only one a day.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. And when you're doing like focused writing for like a paper or setting out a course or anything like that, do you work with music in the background or sounds in the background or silence?
The music, which is not generally the radio.
Okay, for example, you've got me curious.
So for example, I switch between things. So I'll do like Radio 3 at a certain time of the day between 10 and 12, because then I don't like the evening shows. Or I'll do Radio 2 in the morning between 8 and 9. So I vary because of what I like. But it's never a playlist. It's always talking, noise, songs, whatever in the background. I do something live. I don't go to a playlist or when I'm writing.
I find the answer to that question I find so interesting. Like myself, if I need to focus, I need music, but I can't have music that has words, because if I have music that has words, then I get distracted and I start singing along in my head rather than focusing on what I'm doing. But I need a level of music as sort of like white noise in the background, because if it's pure silence, like the tiniest little noise, and I'm like a dog that hears a squirrel a mile away, I'm like so distractible. It's not even funny.
It's interesting because I have found myself typing the words to what I'm hearing sometimes, and I have to go back and think, why did I, so those things do happen, yeah. Love comes up in the middle of a sentence when you're writing about dementia.
Oh my word, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Oh, right. Next question. What time of day, so not exact hour, but like morning, afternoon, evening, do you feel you're most productive?
Oh, definitely I'm a nighttime worker, writer.
Okay.
So from 7 o'clock, my brain can come alive in the evening, and I can write till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Whoa, that's awesome. That's really cool. What is your favorite referencing manager or system?
I'm going to share the thing. I cheat.
What do you mean you cheat? Oh, we need top tips. How do you cheat?
So I used, when I did my doctorate, I used RefWorks and all of those things. And sometimes when I'm doing things, I have my own sort of system that works for me. Although all
Okay.
my PhD students are told they must use a reference manager, but I don't use one. I cheat in the referencing in the sense of I use Google Scholar.
Does Google Scholar do referencing?
Well, not necessarily. For a reference list, I drop the person's details in Google Scholar. Then when the paper comes up, I go to the little cite button and it tells it to me really, it already cites it in, particularly, for various versions of Harvard, Chicago, MLA, Vancouver.
Oh,
So
that's a top tip.
that's a little hack I use.
I had no idea that it did that. That's a quality top tip. I like that.
Because sometimes reference managers can be fiddly and they don't always, they miss the comma or the dot, and if you want to be perfect, as we do, or they miss out a letter, or you have three authors and they still put et al, and you're like, that's not what the journal wants. Whereas I find Google Scholar works.
The amount of hours I think everybody puts into referencing is absolutely ridiculous. So any top tips are always welcome. I'm definitely gonna have to check out that Google situation. Right, next question. Your favorite desk snack?
I don't have one.
No, you don't eat while you work.
No, not at
Oh,
all.
I am jealous of that amount of self-control.
I don't have a snack at all. Nothing really.
That's fair. You don't have to. I'm just like
I
the
feel
long.
awkward now that I should have something probably, but I don't. Although I'm using someone's desk at work, a different office, and they have these things on their desk, little
Oh, they
chocolates.
look tasty.
There's loads of them around. I'm like, okay, this person is there's even a little biscuit barrel with biscuits in it.
Nice. But for
So,
you
no,
managed to avoid the temptation.
yeah, I'm not a no.
Nice. Well done. Right. When you're planning or organizing, so whether that's your day or a project or anything like that, do you tend to use a digital tool to help you plan and organize your life and work, or do you use pen and paper?
Probably it's a combination.
Okay.
So my diary, it has to be digital, otherwise I am lost. But if you and I were in a meeting, this will come out because I'd have to make notes. Because my fat fingers can't type quick enough in the note function in iPhone. So I'd have to write. Most times I can't understand my handwriting afterwards, I'll be honest.
Ah, no, I'm the same. I do hybrid. Right. Next question. What book are you currently reading?
It's called, it's a really childhood book.
Okay.
It's called Stories from the Caribbean. And it's folk
Ooh.
tale. It's folk tales we would have grown up with in the Caribbean. So, like there's a folk. The one I just read last night was about, we call it Anansi, which is a spider.
Okay.
Arachnid Anansi, and the story tells you how Anansi got the shape of a spider. You know. And it's because he was invited in the Caribbean folk tale is he was invited. He was very greedy for eating, and he was invited into to a party, but there were two parties in the village. And so he took his children and he sent one of the child to the left and one to the right. And he says, tell me which one has the better food and which one starts first. But, you pull on. So he tied a rope around his waist and he said, you pull on me if it starts this way and you pull on me if it starts that way. And that's how the spiders form the way it is.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, you'll have to do because what I've started doing, because I love books, and so I'm always asking people what they read, which is why that question's in the Rapid 11. But what I've started to do is sort of compile a list of what everybody who's been on the podcast reads. So you have to drop in like either a link to where we could find the book or the author of it so that I can add it to our virtual researcher reading library.
Yeah, sure.
Because
I,
that
I, I
sounds
mean,
fascinating.
yeah, it was just to because I'm born and brought up in the Caribbean, and it was just to reignite myself with the folk tales and what those folk tales mean, and those things we learned as children.
No, that's
Yeah.
beautiful. I love that. Last question is before we start the actual podcast is who is a researcher that you admire?
Gosh, there's so many.
You can
Um,
have more than one if you want.
I mean, there are people who taught me about research.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sense of, there's people like Professor Carol Baxter, who's now retired, Dame Elizabeth Anuwanu. These were Black women who were pioneers in research, in their own right. So there are those women who I hold close to heart. And then we have the more contemporary researchers, people like Professor Laura Sarand, Professor Berta Ochieng. I'm really in awe of the work by Professor Julie Sanders. And Julie looks at workload modeling and the clinical academic side, and she looks at, inequalities in health for women in cardiac research. So it kind of straddles my area. So notice I haven't said any men because I haven't really. There's Professor Mark Rifle, and Mark is wonderful and dear, and I'm in awe of everything that Mark does, really. Um, and what's wonderful is how Mark still combines doing research work and his large role and portfolio in NHS England. You know, so that's wonderful. But yeah, it's mainly been women to this point.
But I think too, like before we dive into it, I think that's something that is one of the things within nursing research is that because generically there are more women who are nurses than men, that it's probably easier to identify women nurse researchers than it is men because there's just not the proliferation. And there's not many nurse researchers anyway. So
Yeah. And I should say, someone who has been quite instrumental in my growth and development as a researcher has been Professor Deborah Jackson in Australia. So Deborah's been listed as the top research nurse in Australia for the last couple of years running. So it's really wonderful to know her and be mentored and coached by her.
that's really cool. Thank you for sharing
Sure.
that. So let's dive into it now. So aside from your role, um, take me back to the beginning. So you and I, we met each other on the chief nurse's office, shared decision-making research council, which I always get in the wrong order because it's the longest title ever.
For research.
For research. I always get it mixed up. But I don't know your backstory. So I know you're a nurse researcher, but how and why did you get into research?
Okay, the easiest way to say this is to share this story of when I was a student nurse and I qualified way back when in 1995. I was one of the first cohorts of Project 2000 at the University of Essex. Um, when I was a student nurse, I could not understand the heart. I literally drew a heart in the shape of a love heart. I just couldn't. And then I think the aorta should come here and this should be a ventricle. And I just could not understand the heart. I could understand it, I just couldn't draw it. And cardiac became really difficult for me. And then I had a placement on a medical cardiac ward. And then I decided after I qualified, and you'd hear in lots of my other things I've talked about, my problems with immigration, etc. But I got a job at St. Thomas's Hospital to work in a cardiothoracic ICU.
Okay.
Because I wanted to challenge myself.
I was going to say, wow.
I didn't know the heart, and I wanted to learn the heart. And when you're so newly qualified and you're into it, and you those things, where I'm a registered nurse now, and you kind of live on that for a while. I went into clinic with one of the consultants, and I was annoyed that I was a registered nurse, should be doing all the fancy things in ITU. I was sent to follow a consultant in clinic. And honest to God, it was so mind-blowing because he took a piece of paper, he drew a square, he drew a line across and a line down, and he said, This is your heart. It has 4 chambers. Left, right, upper, lower, blood. And I was like, oh my God, why didn't they teach me that in university? Why didn't they tell me that's how to understand the heart? So the story is I challenged myself with things I couldn't do. And I couldn't understand research. I didn't know what quantitative meant and qualitative meant, and it muddled my mind, and I was scared of statistics and numbers. So I ended up doing a PhD, and I did a mixed methods thesis that really challenged me to do qual and quant. So I take on those challenges really. So that's how I started, and you know, I had a lovely career at Guy's and St. Thomas's, where I then, while I was studying, I became disillusioned. I'm not sure if you lived in this country then, but in the 1990s, you know, there were lots of stuff happening in healthcare, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay as a nurse. So I went to university and I did a degree in politics at the University of London, because I was going to do something entirely different from nursing. And then I learned really and truly how political our career and health is. And
Mm.
and then I came back after, you know, when I say came back, I, I, I resumed working properly as such after my degree finished. And my manager says, wow, you got a degree. What are we going to do with you now? And then I started looking after the internationally recruited nurses. So I looked
Okay.
after the first ever cohort of Filipino nurses at Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospital to get their NMC PIN number and that adaptation thing. And then I liked teaching and learning. So I moved to a university after that,
Okay.
which is now called the University of West London. And then from there, I was like, okay, next step is to challenge myself and do a doctorate. So I applied for a scholarship, which I got, and that's how my career in research started.
Okay. Oh wow, that's brilliant. I love it. That you just dove into something that you found really challenging and that you didn't understand. I think that's fabulous. Um, so fast forward, completed your PhD. Um, what what is your when you think about your research, what is the thing that you love to research, that you're passionate about, and what drove you to research that area?
So I have a mother and 5 sisters. Or my mother died, and one of my sisters died. But you know, typically I have 6 female siblings, and including my mother as such. And so I've always grown up around women and understood women's health. And hearing people talk, you know, in terms of women talk about their health and seeing their experiences. So I was always interested in women's health. So that's what I wanted to research. And so I looked at life after stroke among African Caribbean women living in East London, and I was looking at the personal, social, and cultural factors.
Hmm.
We know racism exists in this country, and racism exists in nursing. We have our regulator who's publicly apologized on their website for the racism that's been caused. Um, and it exists in different forms. So when you're someone from a minority background like me, where you sound differently, you look differently, I was really scared to say to people I was researching race.
Really?
I didn't because you're young, you're now trying to start a career, and you're it's like and you're I was I mean I trained in Essex, and I mean very white Essex I trained in. Um,
Okay.
we didn't really have black patients to look after. When they taught us in school, they taught us things about Jewish people, and you know, how you look
Oh,
after them if they've died, and you know what a kosher meal is, and you
yeah.
would get what you get now in London and other parts of England, you know, African, Caribbean, Asian meals, etc.
Yeah.
So I and you know I'm not knocking Essex for that. You, as Maya Angelou said, you do good until you know better, and that's
Yeah.
what they knew. But I was scared. I was scared of talking about race. So I started off my career with things like looking at culture. Because culture was a way to mask race.
Okay.
And when I moved, I I you know, you as we do, we all move around jobs. And when I came to London South Bank, it took a white woman to tell me I was putting in a grant application. And I said, oh, Prof, do you mind just looking at this for me, please, and telling me what you think? And she sent it back and she said, I think you're looking at race, you're not looking at culture. And it took a white woman to give me the strength to say, actually own what you do. You are looking at race.
Wow.
And that's where I began to blossom. And, I mean, she probably doesn't even remember telling me that because she reviews so many people's work, because when you are a professor, all these things come across your desk. But to me, that was really meaningful. And it meant she also took time and she understood what I was saying. And, just that comment, I think you're looking at race, not culture, made me realize, okay, I need to stop this masking and actually own what I do. So that's when, I started being more vocal and public about I look at race. So you see some of my initial grants, my Mary Seacole Award was to look at stroke carers and, cultural competence. And you'd see some papers talk about cultural this. And I was really masking things.
That's interesting. So now moving forward,
Mm.
you've just exploded on those themes.
Yeah, I mean, moving forward, listen, it's really difficult to get research money to look at racism because if you show racism exists, then you have the person who funds you or where your report sits, they then have an onus to do something about it based on your recommendations. So nobody really wants to fund you to do something like that. So, but there are, we are in a, I call it enlightening period where people are looking at race closely and, we're doing things differently. So things are changing slowly. Um, what I realize is part of my work, because I enjoy teaching. I love sharing knowledge with people. And apart from doing research, so I have these two things that sit side by side. And I guess that's why we do academia, because you can share your knowledge with people and experience and empower them through that. And then you can also go away and do that research bit that you like. So one of the projects, when you say exploded, or one of the things I've realized is, Chris, I should have said to you, I still work clinically. One day a week on a Saturday, I still work in intensive care clinically. So what I wanted to do is, because I also love nursing. I love caring and looking after patients. When I go in, I say to them, I don't want to be in charge. I don't want to do blah, blah, blah. Just give me my patient. I don't care if it's the sickest patients in the unit, but just let me do the nursing care, because that's what I really enjoy doing when I'm there in the hospital. And one of the things is I soon realized that I love this job, but what I realized when I go around at conferences and I go to big talks, it lacked black and brown nurse researchers or nursing and midwifery researchers. So I just going to move slightly to the other side while we're talking. You sure? Sorry, I'm just using somebody's office, as you know, and they just came in. So um, I realize that we're lacking in those things. So one of my current projects at the moment is how do I begin to develop black and brown researchers in nursing and midwifery? How do we, because we write papers, okay, and we tell people things like, if you're doing a project around race and ethnicity, you should match your researchers to your samples group. But we're not developing researchers to match to the sample group. So here we go. So one of the projects I'm doing right now is an NIHR funded project looking at developing black and brown nurses. So part of my research thing is about developing a cadre of people who are able to undertake research. And those things that you and I would have read about, and we know the mindset and the language is changing that says, hard to reach groups, underserved communities, lack of engagement from them. It's probably because of these things. We don't have the right type of researchers working with them. And if we have black and brown researchers researching black and brown people, then we get more credibility, we get more trustworthiness of the research, and we learn. So this is where I'm sitting at the moment. So I'm running a program, but the program is also research. Does that make sense? Because I will have to evaluate it and look at how these people learn and what we do differently and all of that. So it's a research project that is delivered through an academic program. So in some respects, I'm doing two things I really love, the research bit and then empowering teaching and learning.
I that sounds amazing, Calvin. I didn't realize that it was combined because I've heard you talk about the research capacity building work that you were doing, but I didn't realize it was wrapped up within a research project as well. It's fascinating. And I think like it's such important work to do. And I find even myself as a Caucasian female and the research that I do, I found it so interesting how much just generically people have unconscious bias. So in my own PhD, I found this hilarious. In my own PhD, I had 3 different sites. And of the 3 sites, I had one who had a nurse PI who was male, and then the other 2 sites were PIs who were female. And I'll let you guess, but which one didn't have any females recruited? And it was so interesting because I challenged them because I had 2 phases. So I had a survey phase and then I had a interview phase, and I could only interview people who'd done the survey. And so on the 3rd site, I was looking for females and I was going through like everybody who'd completed the surveys, and I was like, there's no women. And I messaged him and I was like, where are all the women? He's like, no, we've recruited loads. And I'm like, yeah, you haven't? But it was completely unconscious, and it wasn't like he was the only person doing the recruitment, but in that leadership position, it somehow filtered down. Even though a lot of the people who were doing the recruiting were females, it still seemed to be this thing. And I think even more so when it comes to like going even further with that border. So women is one thing, but then women and individuals who are, like you say, black and brown, it gets even harder to get their community to buy into the idea of research. And I had a earlier podcast that I did with just a really short one with Professor Ian Jones, and he had a really interesting idea and raised some really interesting issues that I'd never thought about. So he's really advocate, similar to you, of increasing research participation, no matter what color or creed you are. And he uses a model of taking it into the community. So instead of having research participants being recruited from hospitals or whatnot, he'll take his research team into like a community center where they're having some sort of event, and he's known in the community not as Professor Jones, but just as Ian, the guy who likes to ask us a lot of random questions, in order to build that capacity. So I think with all of your knowledge and all of your expertise, what would you recommend for whether it's researchers like me at early stages, or even people who are just starting on this journey? How can we go about trying to ensure that our research doesn't put up those sorts of barriers for people who are black and brown? Like what should we be aware of?
So I think there's two things. I have a paper I'm working on, which I should finish by the end of February. It's developing a framework for social justice praxis and research. So what you should look for if you want to make sure that whatever research you're doing has applied a social justice lens. So I think it comes back to those same things. There are some basic things. What are our underlying assumption of the sample group we're going to work with?
Okay.
So, do we, so that's the first thing, what are our assumptions? And then I think the second thing is who's going to be our research team? But particularly if you're looking at black and brown people and racism, you want to make sure your research team, and okay, so, you may have the PI who is a white person because we know that's how things work sometimes. But who are the other people on the team? that makes it credible,
Yeah.
trustworthy, reliable, dependable, those things we talk about. So who are those people on the team? Did they come from the public? Are they trained researchers? And also not to homogenize people, because I have found that, there are different types of Black people. So
Okay.
there's your African Black,
Ah.
there's your Nigerian African Black, there's your Ghanaian African Black, your Sierra Leonean, your Cameroonian, there's your African Caribbean. Each hold their own sets of beliefs, culture, and practice. And research
Mm.
historically, when they say Black people, that's what they were talking about. They just labeled everyone, and we got to remember Black people from the Caribbean, which is where I'm from. We have a slave ancestry, so we've known
Mm.
slavery is that part. African people who come from Africa, they don't have that, but they may also have some. So if you look at Black Portuguese people, in terms of the Ivory Coast, etc., what you're looking at is people who've experienced colonialism
Mm.
compared to African people who haven't experienced colonialism. Yeah. And you would see these little nuances. And I think, so that's why I think, when I say we have to be clear of our underlying assumptions of people we're going to research. And we know sometimes for research purposes, we cannot break everyone down into a group because then it doesn't become meaningful. But we need to also learn how we recognize that differences exist so people are not
Yeah.
homogenized
Yeah.
as we want.
I really like how you've worded that. That's really brilliant. And I think regardless of what you're thinking about when it comes to your sample, I think that's a really important thing, that it's okay to have differences
Mhm.
and to acknowledge those differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have 150 subgroups within your
Mhm.
population if you were doing like a big study.
Yeah.
I really like that.
And
Allows
if
differences.
Yeah, and even if you were, let's say, for example, you're doing a focus group and you had different type of Black people, as I said, and someone said, oh, well, in my community, we do blah, blah, blah. Then a really trained and skilled researcher would say, tell us about your community then. Where does your community originate from? Why does your community, and then open it to the rest of the group. Does this happen in other communities differently? So we can see even when you report the research, although you homogenize as Black, you could say within these groups there were differences because people came from different communities, and this is how they expressed it.
Yeah.
So that's why I say, that's why we need to develop researchers who could
Yeah.
understand those areas, those nuances, and learn how to drill down into them.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Another thing I was really curious about, so because of who I am and the type of researcher I'm trying to develop into, I'm really keen to try, and which is why I loved like the book that you're reading about, like those
Mhm.
cultural groundings in a childhood
Mhm.
from your own background.
Mhm.
I really like to try and educate myself on what other people might feel around research. And one of the things that in some of the reading that I've done around creating more diverse and inclusive research studies so that you get that richness in your given population, so that you're not just researching white men, which, let's be honest, the vast majority of research is all about.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, and I think that's a historical, and I think there's a movement happening that will change that. And a lot of the reading that I've done around trying to better understand issues around social justice and within research, especially within those Black and Brown communities, there's a lot of talk about historical injustices. And I've read books like The Immortal Cells of Henrietta Lacks.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering, like, is that also, in addition to being aware of my own potential assumptions and biases, is that something that researchers also need to educate themselves around in order to build a better connection with those populations? Is that, especially like you mentioned, in the more American populations or communities that are connected to that American association, because that's
Mhm.
kind of where a lot of that happened because of
Mhm.
the history around slavery, like the
And the
syphilis
cotton
study and
fields,
things like
yeah.
that.
So I think the first thing, even before we go that far,
Mm.
is that we need to recognize. So again, it comes back to, as you say, getting when we do research, and all of us who are researchers, we know how difficult recruitment is. Recruitment is extremely difficult. And here you have a group of people who we describe as difficult to engage again, and hard to reach and find, etc. Um, One of the things we got to recognize is, why would they want to talk to us? And the reason why I say that is, we need to recognize a, a vast number of black and brown people come with trauma.
Mm.
They have trauma. So, a young black man who has been stopped by the police 3 times for driving his mother's car. He's mixed race, but he looks more dark, and his mother is white. Yeah.
Mm.
He's been stopped for driving her fancy car and really been pushed around in the system in that sense. Why would he then want to trust you that he will tell you his health data and feeling, and that you will do something different? Because he
Right.
comes with that trauma of already distrusting white people and how
Yeah.
white people in certain services treat them. So
Yeah.
we know in the health service, for example, our line of work, we know the inequalities. Black
Yeah.
women are 4 times more die in childbirth. We know the things around, stroke, for example, and cardiovascular health in our
Yeah.
areas. So
Yeah.
if we know these inequalities exist because racism plays a part, why should I trust you? I
Yeah.
might have engaged with the health service and been treated badly already. So why should I tell you, what difference are you going to make? So I think when we're training researchers and we're developing researchers, we're also developing researchers to, it's not saying this is qual, this is quant, this
No.
is mixed methods. It's beyond that. It's
Yeah.
how do we engage with populations that would carry a trauma,
Yeah.
that has a trauma and will not trust you.
Yeah.
I'm doing a program this week. It's starting. It's looking at developing. It's for the Nigerian Nursing Association here in England. It's
Mm.
developing leadership in Nigerian nurses, and one of my sessions is building a trusting relationship with the NMC. How do we get nurses to build a trusting relationship with the NMC? Because the NMC is not punitive, but it looks punitive on what they do, yeah. But
Yeah.
how do we get diaspora nurses who have only heard bad things about the NMC to develop a trusting relationship with our regulator? And I think
Yeah.
that's it comes back to that. How do we train researchers that participants, samples, communities, groups will trust them? They will be part of it. And it's things like Dr. Roxanne Crosby Nairobi, who set up the Rome. It's called Rome. It's a platform for research and ocular eye health at Moorfields
Mm.
Hospital. And they have something over 10,000 people registered on Rome who wants to get involved in eye research and wants to know about it. But how did they do that? They went out to communities. They
Mm.
built the relation, not only because they wanted to do research. Oh, there's an Asian festival happening in, wherever this week. Let's go there and set up a tent. Let people know us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sometimes as researchers, we tend to just go where our research takes us. But we need to stop that and actually engage in community, whatever community festivals, events, and be visible, because that's part of developing the trustworthiness and the credibility. And I
Yeah.
think that's really important.
I really like that because it's a very, I don't know, I can sometimes feel very overwhelmed
Mm.
because I want to um try and make my own work more inclusive because even though I have I don't know if you've seen it. I really like it. There's a couple of different versions on YouTube, but they have this video that basically talks about the social injustice, and they have like a whole mixed group of people all on the same starting line, and then they say, okay, take a step forward if you have this characteristic and that characteristic and whatnot. And it's all based on statistics and epidemiology about what that means, both, and I've seen it for health as well as like leadership positions and things like that. And it's a real stark visible example of where how different your starting point is, depending on whether you're male, your socioeconomic background, where your family came from, the color of your skin, the country, like all of those factors. And so although I'm not a white male, I still know, compared to the vast majority of people, I've got certain automatic head starts, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I because of who I am, I'm very passionate about trying to break down those barriers and be more inclusive. But I can sometimes feel really overwhelmed with, trying to understand or right all of those wrongs. And so I really like how you've described it. It's about building that a relationship, rather than, oh, I need you for this study. Or I need you because I need X amount of people who aren't Caucasian, or whatever it is. It's actually about getting into that community, being seen, being trusted, and build that up, rather than just being like, I've got the study and I need you for X. So thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's important, because then the relationship becomes symbiotic at some point, where both parties, benefit from each other. So it's simple things like, explore going on a radio station. Go to an Asian network and radio station and say, they would love to have you, and say, look, I want to talk about blah, blah, blah. I want to talk about diabetes today and how that relates to cardiac health and
Yeah.
ischemic heart disease. And they
Yeah.
will give you a 20-minute or 10-minute slot. Rather than do it on your own, get someone of that background to sit there with you. So that gives you the credibility and the trust again.
Yeah.
So, we research and work in health, and we sit in these, lovely ivory towers as such. And there is no reason why we cannot liaise with local councils, find out what's going on out there, and make ourselves present. If cardiovascular research is your thing, if stroke is my thing, if eye health is your thing, then you go and you just pitch up there and you give a health tent. And people will see, they'll remember, they'll take something away. And then you say, look, if you want to know more, we did a radio interview on Asian Network Radio, or the Ghanaian radio station, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's ways of building inroads into communities. So I think, as I said earlier, my thing is, don't wait till you want to research that group to then look at building the relationships. We should have that blueprint from now of how we're building it.
Oh, love it. Absolutely love it. Because it's like I said, it makes me feel like less like I said, like, I'm not trying to fix everything. It's more about getting people to trust me, rather than me being a representative for everything that might have happened long before I was even born. But I also found it really interesting about what you said is, again, that allyship can go both ways. So having that introduction into the community, but then the reverse is true, is then your research and your relationship with that community will help hopefully build more evidence to make sure that, whether it's our healthcare pathways, whether it's our actual treatments, are actually more amenable to all of the wide variety of communities that we are trying to serve.
Yeah, agree.
Very cool.
Sure.
Thank you. So just out of curiosity, other than like what you're working on doing, that research project about building research capacity, are there resources online that you would be confident in pointing people like myself to, that would help like early career researcher or mid-career, whatever they are, start to I mean, you mentioned about the framework that's coming soon, so I'll definitely have to make sure people follow you so that paper is
Sure.
accessible. But are there other resources that would be beneficial for researchers to think about at early stages, so that it isn't just that transactional, oh, we need to have this many for recruitment, but they actually build that inclusivity in, and that into their actual framework of their projects?
Um, there are so many things that exist, right? And I can't really pull one out to tell you. One of the things I could tell you is I led a chapter in a book by Professor Deborah Jackson, edited. It's an international handbook on research
Okay.
and for nursing, particularly for nursing and health. And we wrote the chapter on the book is called Navigating the Maze of Research. And we wrote the DEI chapter, so diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
How do you make, and that chapter is chapter 11. It gives some really top tips on how to, and some of those things I've shared here already, how to be that inclusive researcher, how to understand what diversity in research means. And we wrote it from three perspectives. I took the whole social justice equity perspective. Professor Ruth Northway in Wales, whose background is in learning disabilities, she looked at how we include learning disability people into research. And Ruth Oshikanlu looked at, as a health visitor, midwife, women and their health, and how do we include those sort of different diverse groups in their health. So it's a great chapter to read, and I'm sure it's available. It was produced by Elsevier, and I'm sure it's available online too.
What I'll do is, for everybody who's listening, is I'll make sure we include that in the description so that if people want to get that as a resource, I'm sure it's widely available on the internet. And if not, a university, a library is going to be able to get a hold of that for anybody.
Definitely. Yeah.
Excellent. So, stroke research, equal social justice issues. Is there anything else that, when you're thinking about research, that you would really like to see more of within nursing research? As
I will still like to see, as I said, I started off my research career, looking at gender. And when I say gender, again, I was so naive, I was masking saying I was looking at women's health. I still think we need to have more research into women's health. And now we need to look at earlier on you alluded to it, the intersectionalities of women's health. So, what is it like to be female, single mother, living in a low socioeconomic area, being a traveler from the traveling community, or being, from a non-speaking English background, doesn't necessarily always have to be race. How do we begin to look at those intersectionalities, and how do they become the factors in research? What do those intersectionalities play? I think that's really important when we want to make a headway into research with women, because I think we stand a risk that when we say women, or we say gender research, meaning women, or equating gender research to women, we run the risk of, again, that homogenization. Oh yeah, well, we've looked at women, but actually, who's women health? And I see this. I don't want to be picky, but I've always been critical of Athena Swan at times. That I love Athena Swan and I support it, but how much has Athena Swan advantaged the career of white women compared to non-white women?
yeah,
And if you've been to some of those national Athena Swan meetings, you see it. You see exactly what I'm talking about. So I think it's important that, although we say, we know historically men's health was always top of the agenda and probably remains to a point, but we really need to when we look at women's health, we need to focus on the intersectionalities and how those intersectionalities make a difference. What is the difference? Okay, I work in academia. What is it like to be a senior lecturer or an academic in Oxford or a Russell Group University, to working in a university where I work in a deprived area of South London, where, people's characteristics are different? What is the difference for those women, for example? What is the impact on their health? And, someone alerted me on Twitter this weekend to a recent paper published in America where they said racism contributed to the incidence of stroke among African American women. Now, I have always done stroke research, and I know you've done cardiovascular research, and we know what the comorbidities and the underlying risk factors are. So we go hypertension, obesity, and we look at all these: ischemic heart disease, diabetes. We know those factors. And here's this piece of research that says women who experience racism also experience stroke. And again, here's some intersectionality, because they looked at race from a socio-demographic perspective, that fine. And it makes us just think, okay, so, how does racism impact on heart disease? The fact that if you're a direct recipient of racism or discrimination or gender discrimination, how does that impact on your health?
Yeah, I think like that's such an important thing, and it's something that like I find really fascinating. So there's two things that I witnessed, and I think it's like you said, it's that intersectionality, but I think it's also how people with non-wealthy white male characteristics are perceived by a healthcare system. So in my PhD, just randomly, one of the individuals who I interviewed with heart failure about her treatment burden. So the workload that she was expected to do because of her illness, her heart failure, as well as her capacity to do that work and influencing factors around that. And I ended up having to kind of put all of that data on a shelf because it wasn't really usable within my PhD. But the story she told about her voice not being heard and the liberties that she voluntarily sacrificed in order to prove to her medical team that she wasn't lying, because they looked at her and they saw female, single, low socioeconomic status, and they automatically assumed that her heart pathophysiology wasn't responding to the drug because she wasn't taking it. And so she actually took steps, and she said to the doctors, okay, well, fine, put me in hospital. I don't need admitting, but put me in hospital and have the nurses administer my drug, and then we'll see what happens. And so they put her in the hospital. The nurses administered her drugs, recorded that she took them, and her heart still behaved the exact same. And still the doctors were like, well, it can't be, there must be something. And it took her a year of advocating and fighting to get somebody to listen to her voice before she was heard and seen. And they recognized that for whatever reason, those treatments they were giving her, and they might have been evidence-based, but again, that evidence was probably based on white males, not females, didn't do anything for her heart. And it wasn't until she got like her voice heard, somebody being advocating for her, and started to experiment and get her on better drugs. But by then, like a year had gone, and there was so much extra damage done to her heart because of the bad rhythms and all this other stuff. And I'm just going like, how can I, as a researcher, start to try and change that narrative for people out there in order to, like you say, improve that intersectionality around health and how people are perceived based on what they look like and I mean, I'll be the first one, like I've done it as a nurse, and you don't mean to, but you look at somebody and be like, ah, and then you like get to know them, you're like, oh, okay, maybe I was wrong there. But it's such an important area, I think, within health research that we just don't know enough about yet.
Yeah, and I think it's, as I say, the intersectionality is really important to consider, because those things make a big difference to people's, you may work in a nice postcode but live in a postcode where there's deprivation. So there's two big differences, While your colleagues go out for lunch or they do something wonderful, you're not able to do that.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, I'm very conscious of the time. I could talk to you forever, Calvin. I love all of our discussions. You challenge me constantly, in the best way possible. Like you were saying about some of your heroes, about how they change how you think and make you whatnot. Like you're one of those for me. So, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Any last wise words of wisdom about being a nurse researcher in today's world for our audience?
I mean, my top tip is, follow your dream. There is more than one way to get there. So, and the best thing for me is now there's a clinical academic pathway. So if you really want to get into research, look at the clinical academic pathways, because it helps you if you're like me, where you love nursing and practicing clinically and doing all of those stuff, and then you still want to do research. So I think explore clinical academic pathways if you're going to be a nurse researcher.
I couldn't agree more. I that I'm similar to you, that
Mm.
interaction with those people who, like, I want to have better informed research. Like, it's that interaction with them that really inspires me to keep going. So that's fabulous advice. For everybody out there who's listening, thank you so much for catching up with us on this next episode. As per usual, do make sure you check out the episode description, because it will have details on where to find Calvin, where he's on social media, a couple of his publications, so you can get into a little bit more about the type of research he does and get inspired to do other stuff, as well as some of the other resources that we mentioned in the episode. And I will see you all again in another 3 weeks. Thanks so much for listening.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Don't go away. Up next, we have the top 3 takeaways from this week's podcast by Dr. Rosalind Austin. That turned into a real masterclass of how to build inclusive and diverse research. I'm just still, my mind is whirring with everything that he shared with us. Thank you once again, Calvin, for being willing to come on the podcast and share your experience. There was so much in that. For me, as per usual, at the end of these podcasts, I whittle it down to the top 3 things the top 3 takeaways that to me really struck home. And if you want, let me know in the comments what your top 3 takeaways or top 1 takeaway that you really found useful from this episode. For me, I loved his story into research. So many of our other guests have talked about how it was their natural curiosity or their introduction to structure and ideas around, like, through audits, through quality improvement work, or through research delivery is how they got interested in research. But I loved how Calvin, like, just was like, nope, don't understand it, don't get it. And so the best way for me to better understand it, I'm going to challenge myself and I'm going to get involved with it, because for him, that's how he learned best. And I loved that, because I think a lot of times, and I hear this loads with people who aren't yet in research, and they are very intimidated by the thought of research. And I'd say, listen to Calvin. I mean, he's a professor now, and he admitted himself that, when he started, he didn't understand anything about research, not the difference between the different types and whatnot. And now he's, reputed as being like a really great nurse researcher. So don't let your fear or your lack of understanding around research hold you back. If you are curious, if you are interested in it, then, take a step towards it, and who knows where it will lead you. Second is, I found it, and I'm so grateful that he shared this with us, was that for him, being a man of color in a, let's be honest, predominantly white female profession, even he was really intimidated about owning his own passion about research. So he was fearful about being on the receiving end of racism, because he wanted to research around the influencing factors of people's health who might be brown or black. And I found that really fascinating, and that, for him, it took somebody else who's completely different than him to really challenge him to embrace his own passion. And I think for me, as a top takeaway, is actually to be brave, to stand up and to own that passion, and, to revel in it and to really push it forward. And by doing that, then you'll get to build that reputation of having that voice and that passion in that area that you're really interested in. And whether that's like Calvin around social injustice, or whether that's, you know, some really rare disease that nobody else has ever heard about, the only way that we're going to make sure that lots of other people start to get interested in that area of research is by speaking up and being that voice, being that ally. So thank you, Calvin, for sharing your own insecurities about owning your research, because at the early stage that I'm at, I sometimes do struggle in that area as well. So that was really encouraging to know that that's not unique. So thank you, but be brave. And third is his passion for nursing and using nursing, that patient contact, to really inspire but also stay connected to the things that matter most to the individuals that he's passionate about helping, and staying connected to that nursing, that clinical nursing community. For me, that was my third takeaway, is that reminder, I guess, and the opportunities that we do have now as nurses to, and other healthcare professionals as well, to become this thing, especially in the UK, that is being called a clinical academic. So holding on to a portion of your time of working clinically in a hospital. So, you know, even Calvin as a professor, who teaches, who supervises PhDs, who has his own program of research, he still dedicates 1 day a week to working on the floor in his ITU, to keep that connection, not just to the nurses who work on wards, but also to that patient community. And I think that that's something that's really inspiring, because I think sometimes you think, like, as a nurse researcher, as your career progresses, you're going to have a tendency to get shifted more and more towards that academic ivory tower. And I think we're living in a fortunate time where there are structures and supports that are being pushed to enable nurses, allied health professionals, at least in the UK, to manage to maintain a clinical connection while pushing research forward, because it's now been recognized that individuals who have that connection, their research tends to translate faster, to be implemented better, and to have a greater impact. So I think just a reminder to all of us out there that holding on to that clinical connection is something important to do. So yeah, summing it up. So top 3 takeaways. Number 1, challenge yourself. Number 2, be brave and become an advocate for that area that you're researching. And 3, to keep connected to that thing that is passionate. So if that's clinical work, that's clinical work. If that's connecting in with a specific community, you know, keep connected to that thing that has driven your research, so that you don't lose that connection, so that you maintain the impact into that community. That's it for this episode. Thank you once again to everybody who has subscribed, who's left a comment, who's left a review on your podcasting platform of choice. It's really helping to grow this channel, and it's starting to slowly pick up. So that's really great to see. If you have any questions, or for either myself or for Calvin, probably the best place to leave them would be on the YouTube video, because it's just a really good central place for me to find them and then forward them to Calvin if that's the right thing to do. So yeah, any questions, drop it in the comments onto the YouTube video. Remember to subscribe or to leave a video either on YouTube or your podcasting platform of choice. And I will see you all again in another 3 weeks for the next episode. Thanks so much for listening, and keep asking why.